A routine bus ride turned into a moment of humiliation when a white cop kicked a black teenager off the city bus, for no reason other than his skin color. The teen walked home in silence that day, but his spirit burned with quiet determination. Fast forward years later, and that same teen steps off a black SUV, not as a passenger, but as the new director of the city transit authority. And the cop? Still on duty, completely unaware of who's walking toward him. This isn't just a comeback, it's justice, served cold. You won't believe how the tables turn next. Chapter 1. The Incident. Every weekday morning, Malik boarded the number 19 bus at 7:10 a.m. sharp, backpack slung over one shoulder, headphones in, textbooks under his arm. His routine was always the same: sit in the third row from the back, mind his business, review class notes, and get off near Westview High. For a 17-year-old with dreams of becoming a civil engineer, every minute mattered. He took pride in punctuality and avoided confrontation. Teachers knew him as quiet, disciplined, and focused. He never sought attention. That day, he got it anyway. The bus was crowded: students, elderly folks, workers heading to their jobs. Malik offered his seat to an older woman and moved to stand near the back door. Nothing unusual. The ride was smooth until the bus suddenly stopped at an intersection just a few blocks from his school. A transit officer, white and in his 40s, boarded. His badge glinted under the fluorescent light. He scanned the crowd, but locked eyes with Malik almost immediately. Without questioning anyone else, the officer made his way down the aisle and pointed directly at Malik. "ID," he said curtly. Confused but cooperative, Malik handed over his school ID. The officer looked at it, then back at Malik's face, frowning as if something didn't add up. "You don't look like you belong here," he said loudly enough for passengers to hear. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Malik asked if there was a problem, still calm, still respectful. The officer ignored the question. Instead, he demanded Malik step off the bus for further questions. The driver said nothing. No one objected. It was as if the silence of the bus validated the officer's actions. Malik, embarrassed and unsure of what to do, complied. He stepped off the bus, surrounded by stares, whispers, and judgment. Outside, the officer gave no real explanation. He made vague comments about fare evasion and loitering, though Malik had a valid student pass and had boarded at a regular stop like always. No one else had been asked for ID. No one else had been pulled off the bus. Malik asked again if there was a reason for the stop, but the officer just grunted and waved him away. The bus drove off with Malik standing on the curb, holding his backpack, watching it disappear down the road. He wasn't late because of traffic. He wasn't absent because of illness. He was left behind for one reason: the color of his skin. The humiliation wasn't in the words the officer said. It was in the silence of everyone else. Not one person had stood up. Not one voice had asked, "Why him?" The unspoken message was clear. This wasn't surprising. Malik walked the rest of the way to school. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed kids laughing, parents dropping off children, buses still running. Life moved on, but something in him shifted. This wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, but it was the first time it felt this blatant, this public, this wrong, and no one had done anything. Not the driver, not the passengers, not even the school security officer who later heard about it and just shrugged. At school, Malik didn't talk about it. When his teacher asked why he was late, he said there was a delay. When his friends asked what happened, he changed the subject. What could he say? That he'd been pulled off a public bus like a criminal? That his only offense was looking suspicious in his school uniform and clean sneakers? That he hadn't been loud, disrespectful, or aggressive, but still treated like a problem? The incident lived quietly in Malik's mind, but loudly in his heart. It didn't spark outrage, it sparked resolve. He wouldn't argue back, he wouldn't demand an apology, but he would remember. He would remember the officer's face, The number on the bus, the way people looked away. He would remember how powerless he felt and how much power he planned to earn. That day, Malik made a silent promise to himself. He would never let someone decide his place again. One day, he would be the one holding the badge, not to punish, but to protect. Not to silence others, but to speak up when no one else would. One day, he would be in a position where no one could push him off anything he rightfully belonged to. And one day, he'd return. Not as a passenger, but as the one who sets the route. Chapter 2. The Spark. At home, Malik recounted the incident briefly to his mother while they sat down for dinner. His words were few, but his tone carried weight. His mother, a nurse who had worked long shifts to keep the family afloat, listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't express surprise. Instead, she nodded slowly, acknowledging the experience not as an isolated event, but as part of a larger, painful truth they both understood too well. She reminded him of what she had always said: the world might try to reduce him to a stereotype, but he didn't have to accept it. She emphasized that people in power often misuse their authority, and that power without purpose was dangerous. But real power, earned through knowledge, discipline, and integrity, was the kind that could never be stripped away. She told him he couldn't control how others treated him, but he could control how he responded. And in a system built to exclude him, his best revenge would be to rise high enough to redesign the system itself. Malik's father, who worked in city maintenance and rarely spoke about emotions, simply added a few words. You don't fight back with fists, you fight back with focus. He reminded Malik of the stories of black leaders who had faced worse and gone on to change the world, not because they shouted the loudest, but because they stayed committed when others gave up. He told him that rage was understandable, but it had to be repurposed. Anger without action was wasted energy. But anger converted into achievement? That was unstoppable. Later that night, Malik sat with his books and laptop, but his mind was on more than homework. He searched for articles on civil rights, transportation policy, systemic racism in public institutions. The more he read, the more he realized how incidents like his were part of a pattern, deeply rooted, normalized, and largely ignored. He began to understand that the injustice he faced wasn't personal, it was structural. But that realization didn't discourage him. It motivated him. From that day on, his focus sharpened. He stopped caring what people thought of him at school. Whether teachers underestimated him or students avoided him, it didn't matter. He knew what he was working toward. He began volunteering for local transportation advocacy groups. He signed up for mentorship programs related to city planning and civic leadership. Whenever someone asked why he cared so much about public transit, he'd smile and say, "I just want things to run better." He didn't explain the real reason. He didn't need to. His mentors quickly noticed his maturity, his precision, his hunger for improvement. Malik wasn't the loudest in the room, but he was always the most prepared. When others talked about problems, he talked about solutions. He paid attention to budgets, maps, routes, scheduling logic. He started to view transportation not just as a system of buses and trains, but as a framework that determined how easily people could access opportunity. He realized how something as simple as a bus stop, or the lack of one, could shape the course of someone's life. One particular mentor, a retired transit executive, told Malik that people like him rarely entered the field. Most urban planning boards lacked diversity. Most directors had no first-hand knowledge of what it was like to be profiled on public transport. That's when Malik made a personal vow. He wouldn't just work in the system. He would become a leader in it. And not just to say he made it, but to ensure that no kid like him would have to be pulled off a bus and left on the sidewalk for simply existing. The more Malik studied the system, the more he saw its flaws. Delays disproportionately affected low-income neighborhoods. Bus lines were cut in areas where black and brown families lived. Enforcement officers like the one who stopped him weren't trained to de-escalate. they were trained to control. He wasn't just preparing for a career, he was preparing for reform. His goals crystallized: earn a degree in transportation engineering, gain experience in infrastructure policy, work within the city system, then lead it. But leadership wouldn't just mean a title. It would mean creating a culture of respect, dignity, and fairness. He wasn't driven by revenge. He was driven by vision. The humiliation on that bus became more than a bad memory. It became the fuel for everything he did. It reminded him that his success wasn't just for himself, but for every black boy told he didn't belong. Malik had found his path, and nothing, not racism, not bias, not silence, would block his destination. Chapter 3: The Climb. Malik committed himself fully to academic excellence throughout the rest of high school. He enrolled in every honors course available, signed up for STEM programs, and applied for scholarships relentlessly. He treated each assignment, exam, and opportunity as a stepping stone. While others coasted through senior year, he doubled his efforts, driven by something deeper than ambition. He graduated in the top percentile of his class and earned a scholarship to a respected university with a strong civil engineering and urban planning department. College wasn't easy. The environment was competitive, and the subtle reminders of being an outsider were ever present. In classrooms, he noticed how professors often addressed others more than him, assuming he lacked experience or insight. Study groups formed without inviting him. Internships were offered through connections he didn't have. But Malik kept showing up, kept learning, kept outperforming expectations. He used campus resources, sought mentorship, and joined planning organizations where his ideas slowly gained respect. To support himself, he worked nights and weekends. He held multiple jobs: library assistant, cafeteria staff, and later, part-time research assistant on transportation projects. Every dollar mattered. He sent some home to help his mother with bills. The rest went to books, transportation, and tuition gaps. There were weeks when he slept barely 4 hours a night, but each sacrifice felt necessary. Each challenge reinforced his belief that his destination required persistence most people would never understand. In his junior year, Malik secured a summer internship with the city's Department of Public Transportation. He started at the bottom: data entry, route logging, scheduling reports. While others saw it as boring administrative work, Malik used the opportunity to observe the system from within. He watched how decisions were made, who made them, and whose voices were missing. He asked questions others ignored, analyzed overlooked data, and volunteered for extra tasks. He became known as reliable, thorough, and unusually insightful for his age. After graduation, Malik was offered a full-time position in operations support. It wasn't glamorous: long hours, middle-tier pay, repetitive tasks, but it was a foot in the door. While peers from wealthier backgrounds pursued consulting or graduate school, Malik chose experience. He rotated through departments, route coordination, accessibility audits, fare policy, and later, special projects focusing on equity. His supervisors noticed his ability to connect policy with lived experience. He understood the technical side, but he also understood the human impact, because he had lived it. His proposals gradually gained traction. When he suggested rerouting underused express lines to serve underserved neighborhoods, initial resistance gave way to measurable improvements in ridership. When he drafted a report highlighting the need for better racial bias training among transit officers, it sparked internal discussions the department had long avoided. Malik wasn't just climbing the ranks. He was building a reputation as someone who combined data with empathy, logic with justice. Over time, he pursued certifications and completed a part-time master's degree in urban systems planning. Balancing work and education again tested his endurance, but it sharpened his vision. He was no longer just reacting to past injustice. He was actively designing a future where systems served people fairly. He wasn't driven by anger anymore. He was driven by solutions. He became a liaison between the department and community advocacy groups, mediating tensions and proposing initiatives that fostered trust. His name began appearing on internal leadership shortlists. Older executives sought his input. Younger staff saw him as a mentor. He trained new hires with a focus on accountability and inclusiveness. He began drafting strategic frameworks, not just for transit improvement, but for systemic reform. Throughout the climb, Malik never forgot the moment that started it all. He kept the old student ID that the officer once questioned. He never spoke publicly about what happened, but it stayed with him. It reminded him that his work wasn't about ego or recognition. It was about restoring dignity where it had been denied. Years of study, work, and quiet resilience shaped him into more than a professional. They shaped him into a leader with purpose. He had climbed every rung not to reach the top for himself, but to change what the top looked like for those who would come after him. He had not just learned the system, he had mastered it. And he was just getting started. Chapter 4. The Promotion. Malik's rise within the Department of Public Transportation was gradual but undeniable. Colleagues began referring to him for insight beyond his position. His proposals for equity-based route redesigns, fare adjustments for low-income riders, and internal policy reforms were no longer treated as ambitious suggestions. They became models for action. He was known as a strategist who blended logic with lived experience, someone who understood how systems functioned, both on paper and in people's lives. As internal leadership shifted over the years, Malik became a natural choice for project leadership roles. When the city faced public backlash over delayed routes in underserved neighborhoods, Malik led the crisis response team. He didn't just repair schedules, he led public listening sessions, acknowledged community concerns without deflection, and implemented structural changes that rebuilt trust. When he proposed a pilot program for fare-free buses in the lowest-income districts, skeptics challenged the financials. Malik responded with a comprehensive model that was both cost-efficient and community-focused. The pilot's success attracted statewide attention. In internal meetings, his name came up often, not because of politics or seniority, but because he delivered results. He was still younger than most department heads, but he had more field experience than most of them combined. He had worked dispatch, operations, policy, field audits, compliance, and community relations. He understood how each component intersected. This broad, ground-level knowledge made him uniquely qualified for leadership, even if he didn't seek it out actively. The selection process for the next Transit Authority director began quietly. The former director had announced an early retirement. A list of potential successors began circulating among city council members and mayoral advisors. Malik's name appeared halfway down the list, but quickly moved up as internal reviews highlighted his unmatched blend of operational insight, policy understanding, community credibility, and innovation track record. Some saw him as too young. Others questioned whether he had enough political clout. But Malik had something even more valuable: results. Readership had increased in equity priority zones. Public trust in transportation enforcement had improved. Staff retention in critical departments had stabilized. Systemic bias complaints had declined. Stakeholder surveys frequently cited his work. He had turned data and strategy into community impact. The mayor's advisory board shortlisted 3 candidates. Malik was the only one without a legacy political background. He also had the strongest measurable record. After 2 interviews, he was offered the role of director of the Transit Authority. The offer wasn't just a promotion, it was an institutional shift. For the first time, someone who had used, studied, worked within, and been failed by the system was now being asked to lead it. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. City insiders praised his track record, while conservative voices questioned whether his focus on equity would disrupt traditional metrics of success. Union representatives supported the decision, citing Malik's consistent inclusion of frontline staff voices. Community groups that had once protested transit bias now celebrated the appointment as a sign of progress. Malik accepted the role with a quiet confidence. He didn't announce sweeping promises. Instead, He laid out a clear agenda focused on modernization, equity, sustainability, and accountability. He emphasized that efficient transit wasn't just about logistics, it was about access, dignity, and opportunity. He promised to make the system work for everyone, including those who had been overlooked for decades. His team included both veterans and fresh voices. He restructured hiring pipelines to recruit talent from marginalized communities. He mandated training that emphasized empathy and de-escalation for enforcement personnel. He launched an initiative to study and redesign legacy policies that had indirectly enabled racial profiling and neighborhood neglect. Data wasn't just used for performance, it was used to reveal hidden patterns of discrimination and inefficiency. As director, Malik prioritized transparency. Monthly public reports, community advisory boards, open audits, and direct complaint responses became part of the new culture. The message was clear. The system belonged to the people, and leadership would remain accountable to them. For Malik, the promotion wasn't a reward, it was a responsibility. He hadn't reached a destination, he had entered a new stage in his journey. The title of director wasn't about power or recognition, it was about standing in a place once used to exclude him and transforming it into a force for inclusion. His appointment didn't just shift one department's culture, it signaled a new era, where those once pushed aside were now redesigning the route for everyone. Malik's leadership wasn't just historic, it was a blueprint for what justice in public service could look like. Chapter 5. The Reunion. As the newly appointed director of the Transit Authority, Malik began visiting various transit lines across the city. His presence on the ground wasn't for media optics. It was intentional. He wanted to see firsthand how his policies translated into everyday experiences. He made surprise visits to bus terminals, rode trains without an entourage, and personally spoke to drivers, inspectors, and riders. He believed leadership had to stay connected to reality, not remain trapped in boardrooms or filtered reports. One morning, during a regular field review, he scheduled a walkthrough of several older bus lines that historically served under-resourced neighborhoods. One of the stops was located near his old high school, on the very route where his teenage self had once been humiliated. The number 19 line had changed only slightly over the years, but its demographic, tension points, and general neglect had remained consistent. Among the transit enforcement officers on duty that day was the same white officer who had once removed Malik from the bus years ago. The officer had aged visibly, but retained the same authoritative posture. He had no idea who Malik was. To him, Malik appeared to be another high-ranking official visiting for the sake of protocol. There was no recognition, no flicker of memory. It was just another day to him. But to Malik, it marked the return to the origin of everything. During the walkthrough, Malik observed the officer interacting with passengers. The behavior was not overtly hostile, but remained marked by subtle bias. More scrutiny toward young black and brown males, shorter conversations with white passengers, more immediate demands for proof of fare in certain instances. Malik didn't need to guess. He saw the patterns clearly. What had happened to him was still happening. Quietly. Routinely, systemically. As part of the visit, Malik introduced himself to each enforcement team. When he approached the officer in question, he extended his hand and introduced himself by full name and title. The officer reacted with vague professionalism, still unaware of the deeper context. Malik watched closely. He mentioned having grown up in the neighborhood, mentioned attending Westview High, mentioned having once been removed from the number 19 bus without cause. Slowly, the officer's expression shifted. There was a pause, not of recognition, but of realization. The connection clicked. Memory returned. And for the first time, there was a visible change in the officer's demeanor. No denial, no apology. Just the weight of silent acknowledgement. Malik didn't raise his voice, nor did he shame the officer publicly. His presence, title, and resilience said enough. The reunion wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. Malik had returned, not in anger, but in power. Not to punish, but to witness. Not to relive the past, but to measure how far he had come, and how far the system still needed to go. In the following days, Malik initiated a formal review of enforcement practices on that route. He brought in independent equity auditors and launched a listening campaign with riders. The data supported what he'd already seen: targeted fare checks, uneven interactions, disproportionate removals of youth of color. The department responded by restructuring enforcement training, introducing body cameras for accountability, and rotating officers more frequently to avoid behavioral stagnation and implicit bias cycles. Rather than single out the officer, Malik chose to address the system that had enabled such behavior for decades. He introduced quarterly performance reviews for enforcement agents, including anonymous rider feedback as part of evaluation. He advocated for a department-wide mentorship program where seasoned officers were paired with equity advisors. The goal wasn't to shame, it was to reform from the inside out. The reunion wasn't documented publicly. There were no news stories, no viral videos, no grand announcements. But within the department, word spread. Staff began to understand who Malik was, not just by title, but by origin. The story traveled not as gossip, but as a symbol. The boy who had once been pulled off a bus was now the man reshaping the system that allowed it. For Malik, the moment marked a full circle point, not a conclusion, but a checkpoint. The system had once tried to reduce him to a statistic. Now he was redesigning the very rules it operated under. The officer who had once dismissed him could not erase the past, but he had become part of the catalyst that forced change. Silent justice had arrived, not through confrontation, but through undeniable transformation. Chapter 6. The Message. At a well-attended press conference marking the one-year anniversary of his appointment as director of the Transit Authority, Malik chose to deliver a speech that would define not only his leadership, but also the future direction of the city's transportation system. The audience included government officials, transportation staff, union leaders, journalists, and members of the community, especially those from neighborhoods long overlooked by city infrastructure. He began by acknowledging the technical progress made during his first year. Increased bus frequency, modernized scheduling systems, fare relief programs, and the successful rollout of equity-based route reforms. But he made it clear that policy without purpose is not enough. Efficiency was important, he said, but it could never come at the cost of fairness or dignity. Malik spoke not as a bureaucrat, but as someone who had lived through the system's failures. Without mentioning personal incidents or naming individuals, he described the feeling of invisibility that many people face when navigating public systems. He explained how small acts of bias, fare checks targeting certain faces, inconsistent enforcement, dismissive attitudes, weren't just inconveniences. They were wounds. They left lasting marks on confidence, on opportunity, on trust. He challenged the notion that neutrality was possible in public service. Systems, he said, are never neutral by default. They reflect the values of those who design and operate them. If equity isn't built in, inequality will thrive. If voices aren't included in decisions, silence will echo louder than data. And if power is unchecked, it will be misused, sometimes subtly, often systematically. Malik spoke of transportation as more than infrastructure. He called it the Great Connector, linking people to education, healthcare, jobs, family, and freedom. When transportation is inaccessible or unjust, opportunity shrinks, communities fracture, hope fades. That's why leadership must move beyond spreadsheets and metrics. It must ask, who is being left behind? Who is being watched more than helped? Whose dignity is being compromised? He highlighted the importance of human-centered design, where every policy begins with a question. How does this make people feel? Not just how it performs, but how it impacts lives. Malik emphasized that justice in public service isn't loud or performative. It's structural. It means changing hiring pipelines so that leadership reflects the people it serves. It means rethinking enforcement as a tool for support, not suspicion. It means removing barriers for the voiceless and confronting the complacency of tradition. The audience listened as he detailed his plans to institutionalize equity across departments. This included embedding racial impact assessments into every major decision, establishing permanent advisory seats for residents on oversight boards, and expanding programs that helped formerly incarcerated individuals re-enter the workforce through transit jobs. These weren't charity measures. They were justice measures. They were blueprints for systems that do more than operate. They uplift. Toward the end of his speech, Malik addressed the younger generation. He spoke directly to the kids who might today be riding buses, walking to school, or feeling invisible inside public spaces. He told them they mattered, that leadership would no longer be something they had to crash their way into. It would be something they could grow into with dignity. He urged public officials, fellow administrators, and civic leaders to abandon the idea that change must come slowly. Real justice, he said, doesn't move at the pace of comfort. It moves at the pace of urgency. Delay is often just another form of denial, and for those who've waited their whole lives to be seen, every extra day of inaction feels like a lifetime. He ended his speech with a line that echoed in the hall and across broadcasts. "We are not here to rewrite the past. We are here to make sure it never repeats itself. I did not return for revenge. I returned to build a system where no one else has to come back the way I did." The applause was long, but Malik didn't raise his voice or bask in the moment. For him, this wasn't the finish line. It was the handoff. His message wasn't about his journey, it was about what the journey meant. A system that once treated him as expendable now bore his signature, and through it he had turned silent injustice into undeniable progress. Thanks for watching.